The mountain road had been empty for hours, twisting endlessly through valleys and ridges where no other car had passed. When the beam of the headlights caught the fallen tree stretched across both lanes, its splintered branches jutting out like broken ribs, and Jason, the driver, cursed softly as he slowed the van to a halt. In the passenger seat, Claire unfolded the map for what felt like the 10th time that day, her fingers tracing the pale ink lines in the glow of the dashboard as she tried to find another way through, and finally she pointed to a small gray smudge tucked between the hills. "There," she said, her voice low but certain. "If we cut through this village, it connects back to the main road." The third member of their group, Daniel, a photographer whose restless energy had been grating on Jason all evening, leaned between the seats with his camera already in hand, the flash off but the lens cap missing, muttering that it would at least give him something interesting to shoot after miles of empty forest. So Jason turned the wheel, guiding the van down the narrower road, the forest pressing in tighter, branches scraping against the windows as though reluctant to let them pass, until at last the trees parted and the village revealed itself, a scattering of houses crouched under the shadow of the mountain, their roofs hunched and their chimneys faintly smoking as if the inhabitants had only just stepped away from their stoves. The streets were utterly still. Curtains were drawn in the windows, but cars were parked neatly in driveways, toys lay scattered in yards, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. It looked lived in, alive, and yet not a single light burned inside the homes. Claire insisted they stop at the first house, a two-story place with a sagging porch. Jason knocked loudly, then harder when no answer came, the sound echoing down the empty street. Finally he tried the door. It swung inward with a long creak. Inside, the air was warm, food half-eaten on the table, forks resting where hands had dropped them mid-bite. A man, a woman, and two children sat around the plates, their heads bowed, eyes closed, chests rising and falling in slow, even breaths. "They're asleep," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "All of them." But no matter how loudly Jason called, none of the family stirred, and in the silence that followed, the village seemed to be holding its breath. They left the house shaken, Daniel snapping pictures in rapid bursts though his hands trembled so badly the images blurred, and Jason urged him to stop because the sound of the shutter seemed far too loud in a place that was otherwise drowned in silence. But Daniel muttered that he had to keep shooting because otherwise no one would believe them, not when they said an entire family had simply fallen asleep mid-dinner and would not wake. The three of them walked deeper into the village, the van left idling behind them because Jason did not trust the silence enough to kill the engine, and every house they passed seemed to repeat the same strange tableau, windows showing the vague shapes of figures slumped in chairs, a hand pressed against glass with eyes shut, or an old man leaning against his porch rail as though he had been about to light a cigarette before drowsiness overtook him. Claire tried knocking again and again, on doors, on windows, even shouting at one point, until her throat turned raw. But nothing disturbed the sleeping figures, not even when Jason picked up a loose brick and hurled it against the wall of a shop, the sound cracking like a gunshot before fading into nothing, leaving the village in its unbearable quiet once more. It was then that they began to notice smaller details that made their skin crawl, because the clocks inside every home had stopped at the exact same time, the hands fixed permanently at 2:37, and the phones they found resting on kitchen counters or cradled in limp hands would not power on, their screens stubbornly black as though the batteries had been drained the same moment the villagers closed their eyes. Daniel grew increasingly frantic, muttering that they had to leave, that there was something wrong here, something more than sleep, and when Jason finally agreed and turned them back toward the road, relief spread briefly through their small group until they passed the same sagging porch house again, and then the same rusted bicycle lying on the same patch of grass, and realized that somehow they had circled without ever turning. Jason pressed the accelerator hard when they climbed back into the van, the headlights sweeping across the rows of silent houses, but when the trees opened again, and the road spat them back into the heart of the village, Daniel whispered the truth none of them wanted to admit: there was no way out. The van rolled to a stop in the center of the village square, where a dry fountain stood cracked and moss-choked, and Jason shut off the engine at last because the fuel gauge was dropping fast, leaving the three of them standing in the stale night air while the silence pressed down heavier than before. And that was when Daniel's flashlight beam caught the tall silhouette of the church at the far end of the street. It loomed larger than any of the houses, its steeple crooked but still standing, and as they drew closer the doors stood ajar as if someone had opened them recently, the hinges groaning faintly in the wind though no other sound stirred the air. Inside, the pews were packed full, every seat occupied by villagers sitting upright, their hands folded in their laps, eyes closed in the same suffocating slumber, an entire congregation frozen mid-service, yet still breathing in a rhythm that unnerved Claire so deeply she backed away almost at once. Daniel, however, was drawn forward, his camera flashing again and again as he walked between the rows of still bodies, until he reached the altar where something unusual immediately caught his attention, because the stone floor directly in front of it had been cracked open, jagged fissures spreading outward, as though some force from below had pushed against it. When Jason joined him, they both saw the thing resting in the hollow. A slab of rock unlike anything else in the building, slick and black as if wet though no water touched it, covered with symbols carved so deeply they seemed to pulse when the flashlight beams swept across them, and from the stone itself came a sound barely audible at first, a low humming that grew louder the longer they stood near it, vibrating faintly in their bones. Daniel swayed where he stood, clutching his camera to his chest, his nose suddenly bleeding as he whispered in a broken voice that they should not be there, that they had to leave, and then he collapsed to his knees, his eyes fluttering open and shut as he gasped, "Don't sleep," before slumping sideways onto the cold stone floor. Claire screamed and knelt to shake him, but Jason pulled her back, his voice sharp with fear as he hissed that they were not alone. Because outside in the square, footsteps were moving slowly across the stones, deliberate and steady, though every villager inside the church remained unmoving, their chests rising and falling in eerie unison as if they were breathing for something else. Jason dragged Claire away from the altar, his grip tight on her arm, and together they half-carried Daniel back through the rows of silent villagers, the sound of their boots echoing against the wooden floorboards that seemed far too loud in such a suffocatingly quiet place, and though Daniel was awake, his body convulsed in shallow jerks as if he were caught in the grip of a dream he could not escape. When they stumbled out into the square, the air felt heavier than before, a strange pressure building inside their skulls that made every thought sluggish and every breath feel like it was dragging through water. And Claire pressed her hands against her ears as though to block out a noise that Jason could not hear until a moment later, when he realized the entire village was filled with a low hum that rose and fell in the same rhythm as the villagers' breathing. The sound was not coming from outside but from within his own head, a vibration that slipped into his bones, and as he turned to Claire, he saw her eyes growing heavy, her knees buckling as if some invisible hand was pulling her down toward the ground, whispering to her body that she should join the others, close her eyes, and surrender to the same eternal slumber. Jason slapped her across the cheek, shouting her name, and for a moment she blinked wildly and gasped as though surfacing from beneath dark water. But Daniel was not so lucky, because even as Jason pulled him forward, the younger man's body sagged lifelessly in his grip, his eyes rolling back as a thin stream of blood leaked from his nostrils again, and his voice murmured words that were not his own, in a language that Jason did not understand, but that made his stomach twist as though every syllable carried some primal weight. The houses around them seemed to lean closer, their windows glowing faintly with an amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and Jason realized with sudden horror that the entire village itself was alive, that the roads and buildings and even the stones under his feet were part of whatever force was dragging them downward, and with one last burst of strength, he shouted at Claire to run, though he could already see her eyelids drooping again as the sound swelled louder, filling every corner of the village with the promise of sleep that would never end. Jason half-dragged, half-carried Daniel back toward the church, believing the thick wooden doors might offer at least a moment of protection. But as they crossed the square, he noticed something he had missed before, a jagged seam running across the cobblestones near the fountain, a crack wide enough to slip through, and from it came the same dull amber glow that pulsed inside the houses, rising and falling like the beat of a hidden heart. Claire clutched his sleeve, whispering in a trembling voice that the light was calling her, that she could feel it beneath her skin like a tide pulling her toward the sea, and though Jason wanted to turn away, something in Daniel's feverish murmurs drew him closer, because the unconscious man kept repeating the same fractured phrase over and over again. Below they wait, below, kneeling at the edge of the fissure. Jason aimed his flashlight into the crack, but the beam was swallowed almost instantly by the amber glow, revealing only a narrow shaft that seemed to descend endlessly into the ground, And as the light shifted, he saw what looked like carvings etched into the stone walls, spiraling symbols that mirrored the markings on the black slab they had seen inside the church, twisting and looping in patterns that made his eyes ache the longer he tried to follow them. Before he could stop her, Claire pressed her hands against the stone and leaned close, her lips moving in a soundless rhythm that matched the pulse of the glow, and Jason realized with mounting terror that she was mouthing the same words Daniel had whispered, though she could not have heard them. He yanked her back, shouting at her to focus, but the effort only bought him a few seconds, because her pupils were dilated, her body slack, her mind slipping toward whatever force was whispering through the crack. Then came the sound of movement below, faint but unmistakable, like thousands of bodies shifting in unison, the scrape of stone and bone echoing upward, and Jason staggered back, dragging both Daniel and Claire toward the van, his heart hammering as the fissure widened an inch wider, dust spilling across the square, as though the ground itself was preparing to open fully and let whatever waited beneath the village finally rise. The crack in the square spread with a grinding roar that reverberated through every wall and window, and Jason stumbled as the stones beneath his boots shifted, pulling him to his knees while Daniel's limp body slid from his grasp and lay sprawled on the cobblestones, his chest rising in a shallow rhythm that seemed synchronized with the glowing fissure. Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed almost instantly by the rising hum, no longer faint, but now booming across the village like a choir of 1,000 unseen voices, chanting in a language older than the earth itself. And Jason knew with a sick certainty that it was not a sound meant for human ears, because each syllable made his vision blur and his body sag, as though sleep itself had turned into a weapon. From the widening gap came a rush of heat that smelled of brine and iron, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something enormous moving upward, its shape obscured by the light that pulsed so violently. Now it painted every surface in shades of amber and red, and Jason glimpsed silhouettes writhing far below, dozens or hundreds of figures crawling upward along the carved walls, their limbs too long and their movements too smooth to belong to anything human. He grabbed Claire's arm, dragging her toward the van as she resisted weakly, her eyes glassy and her lips still moving in time with the chant, and for a moment he thought he might shake her free. But then Daniel's body jerked upright without warning, his eyes wide open and glowing with the same amber light, his voice joining the chant as he pointed a trembling finger toward Jason and hissed, "You cannot leave." The ground split wider still, swallowing the fountain whole as cobblestones cracked and tumbled into the abyss, and Jason realized that the entire village was nothing more than a lid, a fragile cover meant to hide what had always been beneath, and now that cover was breaking. He pulled Claire with every ounce of strength he had left, shoving her into the van and slamming the door just as a wave of heat and sound erupted from the fissure, rattling the windows and drowning the night in a blinding light. The last thing Jason saw before darkness swallowed him was Daniel's face pressed against the glass, his eyes burning like embers, as the chant thundered louder, promising that there would be no escape, because in this village sleep was not rest, it was surrender, and it was forever, and it was forever.